Then you get into culture, and your culture has to be bought into by your senior management, and the person who's best able to instill that on people is your chairman, your CEO, the person at the top. But then it needs to be aligned. You can't just have the senior people. It needs to be built up from the bottom as well. I have a good example. One of my clients, they told me this story, and I love to repeat it because it was they had hired a girl right out of high school, and she'd probably only been there for 2 months at the time that this happened. And her job was to fill out the paperwork to issue policies. Essentially, very rote job. You know, she got paperwork, she filled stuff out, and then she passed it on to somebody else. Well, she noticed that about 10 in a row looked exactly the same and had the same unusual characteristics, and it's not important what that characteristic was. But she, 2 months into her job, felt comfortable enough with the risk culture at that firm to say something, not just to say, okay, this is my job, next, next, next. She went to a supervisor ran with it, and they eventually found out that one of the agents was working with some other people to try to scam the insurance company. So she saved them, probably $1 million, 2 months out of high school. I just love that because most people would have been very uncomfortable saying anything. They would have thought they were going to get in trouble for that. So clearly the culture at that firm is strong. The consistency, one of the things that you run across a lot is, say a company has one group that's looking at acquisitions, and then they have another group pricing, that next special hamburger type of deal, whether they're going to put an extra piece of bacon on it or not. And they're making decisions differently. One's looking at one set of metrics, and the other's looking at a different set of metrics. One of the things that ERM can do is to help provide some discipline to that and make it consistent. Part of that is all making it transparent, proactive, doing things in advance rather than after the fact. One of the important things at a strong ERM company is to share those best practices, not just to hold them. Some companies will look at knowledge as power, and certainly some people within companies will look at that, but that's not consistent with the strong ERM process. And the culture is actually the hardest to do. You can do all the other things in a kind of a vacuum and then try to push them, but if you don't have the culture, it's hard to really accomplish the end result, the strategic planning result. Knowledge, transparency comes up there again, knowing and sharing the information. There's several different things you can do with the risk once you've analyzed it. You can accept that risk where you have a competitive advantage. And a competitive advantage can be anything from cost to better sales, size. There's a whole bunch of different things that can create a competitive advantage, and you can exploit that. Other risks you don't want a lot of, and so you try to mitigate or hedge those risks. Other risks you just don't want to touch with a 10-foot pole, so you try to avoid those risks whenever you can. One of the things that has come out in my mind over the last several years is that you really can't transfer risk. We think about reinsurance contract. Well, if that reinsurer goes under, who's the policyholder going to come back to? They're going to come back to you, not to the company that went under. So, and came about with that mainly from the pandemic work that I'd done, where a lot of reinsurers, I think, will really struggle during a pandemic. And part of the reason I say that is because they're not being very transparent about their risks. It's very hard to get that kind of information out of a reinsurer. So the value added, when we get to that standpoint, you're working off of these building blocks, you're leveraging off of them, you're figuring out you're identifying your risks, but then you're prioritizing those risks. So you're trying to get the most important ones. You don't want to have a list of 3,000 risks and then a plan where you think that you're going to work on 3,000 risks all at once. That's just not going to happen. You want to prioritize it and work through them. Now, once you've worked through them 1 year, you need to resort them because some of those, that plan has worked and now they've moved down. They're not as big a deal to you. Now you can work on something else. So you do work through them, but it allows you to, you don't want to bite off too big a piece of the pie at once. You know, it works towards optimizing that risk return profile, providing the discipline to make good decisions consistently. Now the constraints. With the risk management, you're always going to have constraints. You want those to be consistent and aligned. You want them to be publicized throughout the company so that everybody, there's not one pocket where somebody's saying, yeah, we can write variable annuity business when nobody else is allowed to. You want to be consistent on that. You want to look at what that risk appetite is, involve the board. I'm big on having exposure triggers, and both not just on the bad side, but even sometimes on the good side. Say you developed a new, and again I'll come back to insurance because that's where I'm most comfortable, but a new policy. And you thought you were going to be able to write $10 million of new premium this year. And let's say you wrote $8 million in the first 3 months. That should be a flag. Even though, you know, hey, I'm doing great, I'm meeting my goals. Well, if you've done that well, there's a good chance that something got missed along the way, that maybe some pricing was done incorrectly. Maybe you're giving something away. For those of you who go into any business where there's a salesman involved, salesmen are much smarter than mathematicians think they are. They will figure out any inconsistency in our pricing quicker than you do. Okay, so don't always assume that just because you didn't see it that the agent or the other salesman aren't going to figure it out. And one of the important things too is risk ownership versus measurement. It's important for there to be a consistent area at a corporate level that is making the rules, providing that discipline. But if we don't want to take the ownership of that risk and put it in the corporate area. We want the people who are writing the business, selling the hot dogs, whatever, to own that risk and manage it. Now, you work as a staff person and provide help to them, but you don't want the people with the top line responsibility weaseling out of the bottom line responsibility.